and you can share that link with anyone who you know who might be interested. Our guest tonight is the founder and president emerita of Grow Native Massachusetts, and has been recognized nationally as a leader in the native plant movement. She's had an extensive career in the environmental sector and has served as Director of Education for the Appalachian Mountain Club, Director of Drumlin Farm for Mass Audubon, and on the board of the New England Wildflower Society. She's a strong advocate for the importance of land stewardship and believes that conservation begins at home. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Thompson. Go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Carol, for inviting me to do this, and to all of you who are here. It's great to see you coming and here. It's always a little weird to talk to an audience these days and not see them. I have no idea of how you're reacting because I can't see your faces, which is I miss very much, but I will do my best to keep this lively. And Carol, if you see any urgent questions or need to just interrupt for clarification, please feel free to do that. But I will plan on taking quite a bit of time at the end for questions because I really want your questions to be answered, and that part of the program is a lot of fun for me as well.
Okay, great.
So why native plant landscapes matter, and they really, really do. And in order to start to, this always has a little bit of a hiccup. In order to answer that question, we have to first make sure what we mean when we say, what are native plants? And as far as we know, all the plants are native to planet Earth. We do not yet know of any extraterrestrials. So every plant is native. What that means is when we talk about native plants, we have to say native to where. So native plants are local to the area that they have a long evolutionary history. Every ecosystem is a little different. And so plants evolve to be specific to the region within which they are adapted, both to the climate and the conditions, the weather and the soil and those conditions, but also to the entire living system of flora and fauna and fungi and all the rest. So in New England, for practical purposes, we consider plants that were here before European colonization to be native. And why is that? It's because while there are constantly changes and evolutionary changes in plants and changes with the ice ages, those changes happened, relatively speaking, gradually compared to human beings arriving across the sea, across the ocean in ships, and then later planes, trains, automobiles, all the rest, and suddenly introducing plants into an ecosystem that they may or may not have had an integral adaptation to. So if plants evolved here on their own without being transported long distances by humans, they are native to that region. And that's also a common term, is to call them indigenous. When we talk about indigenous people, there are indigenous plants, there are indigenous flora, fauna, the whole bit. So the native range of any given species varies quite a bit. So for example, we have a lovely wildflower here in the eastern United States called Potentilla tridentata. It grows on the mountaintops from Greenland down to Connecticut, down the whole Appalachian Ridge. The further south it gets, the higher in elevation it always is, because it's not adapted to the warmer conditions as it gets further south. So that has one range. Something like a red oak tree has a range that's most of the eastern United States, north of Georgia, and all the way up into Canada. There are very specific plants that might have very local defined ranges. So the range of every species varies. Let's just take a super quick, big picture historical look at this. About 20 million years ago, it's now believed that all the continents on Earth were one landmass, which is called Pangaea. And those continents eventually broke apart and drifted apart, and we got the whole continental drift and the split between Europe and Asia and North America and South America. At the time that Pangaea existed, there were no flowering plants on Earth. And the plant life that existed, relatively speaking, was much less specified than the flowering plants became, and much less diverse in a certain way. And then over millions of years, many different types of plants developed. So if Pangaea, if the continents were starting to drift apart a long time ago, they were well on their way to being quite separate by the time that the flowering plants arose on planet Earth. So flowering plants here did not exist until about 100, 125 million years ago, whereas Pangea as a landmass was quite separated at that time. So that means that the species evolved differently in different continents. And because they were separated by these large bodies of water, they no longer were uniform. So we have genuses of plants that are common from Europe to, say, the United States, but the species vary, and they vary in their adaptations to the other insects and flora and diseases on that continent. There are very few species of plants that could be found on different continents of the globe, and those are called circumboreal plants, and they tend to be in the northern hemisphere, very northern part of Earth, where the circumboreal region and climate and conditions are similar between, say, northern Siberia and northern Canada, etc. But most plant species are quite different from continent to continent. So what's the crux of all this? Plants and animals have this very complex co-evolutionary relationship that makes any given ecosystem work. And that has taken a long period of time to develop, and to develop the unique adaptations that make them fit together. So we know, for example, that many pollinator species may be somewhat specific to the particular plants that they can pollinate. And plants don't actually like to be eaten. So most plants aren't edible to every kind of animal or insect or caterpillar that may come along. But then there are particular plants that are edible to certain caterpillars or certain insect species that are part of the entire food web. And that's what makes the whole system work together. So Lepidoptera, which is just a fancy word for butterflies and moths, can also be quite host specific. There may only be a particular species of plant that particular butterfly or moth can reproduce on, and its young to survive. So there's a whole set of very complex relationships in the system that actually vary significantly in different parts of the globe, in different regions of the United States. We humans are really just beginning to discover the complexity of these co-evolutionary relationships. But when we take a plant from one place, one region, and move it to a very dramatically different ecological region, we're disrupting that evolutionary system that has been working to develop its balance for a long time. So coevolution, plants and animals, that's what holds ecosystems together. So why use native plants on our landscapes? And the first thing we're going to talk about is to protect biodiversity, to protect the stability of those local ecosystems. We all know that the monarch butterfly is supposed to be great, right? We love the monarch butterfly. It's pretty. We know it's declining incredibly dramatically, and that's a bad thing. So let's just look a little bit at the monarch butterfly life cycle and see why that co-evolutionary relationship is so important. And it's so interesting that the life cycle of the monarch butterfly was not understood until really into the 1990s. So it's a recent piece of scientific understanding. And there was a woman along with her husband and other people, but Nora Urquhart, who spent 30 years studying this life cycle. So most monarchs, all monarchs in the North American continent overwinter in Mexico. And a lot of them overwinter over in this eastern part of Mexico. There are a few that overwinter in the western part of Mexico, but let's just say Mexico. And they cluster together like this in a semi-torpid state where they're just hanging out for the winter until spring comes. And then as spring comes and the weather warms, those monarch butterflies fly up to Texas and they find milkweed. And milkweed is the one plant, the one genus of plants that monarch butterflies can eat. Is the only plant that is edible to them. And those monarch butterflies mate, and the female lays her eggs on the milkweed plant so that when the larvae from the eggs hatch, they'll be on the plant that they can eat. And then both the male and the female die because in the butterfly life cycle, after they've mated, both adults die. So with luck, the larvae from the female monarch hatch on the milkweed, and they nibble the milkweed and they grow into monarch caterpillars. And then eventually those caterpillars pupate and they may fly up to Missouri and do the same thing. And then that generation where the adults have died and the young caterpillars pupate might come up to Ohio. So it takes about 5 generations of monarch butterflies every year to make it to New England, to make it here to Massachusetts. And miraculously, we do not have any understanding of why this happens. Let's say that 5th generation of monarch butterflies is able to fly back to Mexico in September. It's totally miraculous. And if it weren't for milkweed along the way, every step of the way, those monarchs would not survive at all. And that's one big reason. There are obviously many inputs and reasons why the monarchs are declining drastically, but the loss of the milkweed plant is a very important factor in the decline of the monarch butterfly. So we know here in New England that when those monarchs, that 5th generation of monarchs gets up here, this is the only plant that they can reproduce on. And there's 5 species of milkweed, from the common milkweed, which is the one that's spreads stoloniferously and is fairly vigorous in fields, to the swamp milkweed and purple milkweed and butterfly weed and things that tend to stay more clumped, and that if you have a small garden, people often prefer these more contained plants. And that's, again, this is just one example of these incredible co-evolutionary relationships of which the thousands and millions of flora and fauna in our system depend on. It's all quite remarkable and amazing. So let's just think briefly about the introduction of non-native plants here in New England. So it began with European colonization. And the biggest reason that plants have been introduced is us gardeners. You know, we love plants. People came to this continent and they'd see something that was new and they'd be like, wow, I'm going to take that back to Europe. And Europeans settling here brought plants that they liked, both for horticultural purposes and other purposes. So that was the point at which plants started to be moved around the globe. But we gardeners are a big factor in it. And another reason is for conservation. Plants have been introduced deliberately, particularly starting with the Dust Bowl era, for stabilizing soil, for windbreaks. It turned out that a lot of those plants that were deliberately planted throughout the United States, because they grew quickly or had properties that maybe some of the native plants didn't, became invasive. Great plants like kudzu. So that's something that we weren't learning about when we first started planting these plants for conservation purposes. And then some plants have been introduced, obviously herbal and medicinal purposes. About 10% of the plants that were here that are not native may have been brought over for that reason. And of course, there are always some accidental introductions that happen to hitchhike on someone's shoes or on a ship or something else, and nobody ever knew they were bringing it. Now, prior to settlement, New England was a very robust, intact ecosystem, which the Native American tribes that lived here did have a lot of management relationships with, and they actually used fire, and we're learning more about how they used fire. But the woodlands and so we humans are very much a part of that system. But there was no agriculture of the scale of which Europeans brought. And Europeans brought a totally different way of growing food and creating the food resources for humans to eat. And that was when the land began to be cleared in a very significant way compared to what had been here at the time. And the peak of farming in the US was around the time of the Civil War. And I think all of us who've walked New England know we see the residual stone walls that were the old walls from where the stones in the field were put, because we have such rocky soil here. It wasn't until after the Civil War with the introduction of trains, the development of trains, and that people began to move west. And some of the farming, particularly of wheat and other large scale crops, was easier to do in the soil of Ohio than, say, the soil of Massachusetts. And what happened post Civil War was that there were abandoned farm fields increasingly, and there was second growth forests that came in. And second growth forest is simply the native landscape that was left, the little bit that had not been cleared, is seeding itself in, and that fields are undergoing succession, and first the birches grow and then the other species grow, and eventually you get more oak and hickory and all of that. So the land here has been through a lot of change, but really until about the Second World War and the development boom of the 1950s, the landscape was still largely native plants. And it's only in the last really less than 100 years that we've seen the dramatic, wholesale, complete reshaping of our plant landscape in New England than we've ever had on the history of this spot of the planet. And what's happened is that we've gone from a largely native plant landscape to this whole range of different plants. So in Massachusetts now, if we're talking about naturalized plants, and by naturalized plants, I mean plants that reproduce on their own. So I'm not really talking about the agricultural crops per se, but all of the plants out there in the landscape that can reproduce on their own. There are not quite, but close to 3,000 species of plants. Now, of that, about 2/3 are native species, and 1/3, almost 1,000 species, are native introduced species, non-native introduced species. Now, that doesn't mean that the biomass, the total plant material, is distributed 1/3, 2/3. The biomass, if you were able to measure it, would be much more non-native than native. And that is because of the approximately 1,800 native species, many of these are endangered species that are very small populations and quite at risk. And of the non-native plants, they may be the dominant plant in the landscape. They're the dominant plant in our developed landscapes now because non-natives have been planted so much more than natives. And within the non-native plant spectrum of these almost 1,000 plants, we go from very aggressive plants that are now being categorized as invasive to plants that aren't aggressive in the same way, but they're not native. So an example of a non-invasive but non-native plant would be like a lilac or Queen Anne's lace. But at the other end of the extreme, we have these very aggressive plants that are so damaging to our ecosystems that they've been classified as invasive. And here in Massachusetts, we have an official regulated invasive species list that has about 145 species on it. It's regulated by the Department of Agricultural Resources, and it is now illegal in Massachusetts to plant that species, to give it to your friends, to give seeds or transplant it or give any parts of it to other people so that it might reproduce further. It's illegal to take it across, to trade it, etc. You're not required to remove it from your property. We would recommend, or I would recommend, that you will do that if at all possible, but you are not allowed to promote its further reproduction in any way. And that list went into effect in about 2006. And some of the species on the list, you probably know some of them well. Here in the upper left, we have black swallowwort, introduced by botanist Asa Gray in the 1800s. And it is an extremely aggressive plant, very difficult to get rid of in your garden. It has these like pea pod-like pods that hold the seeds that spread in the wind quite a bit. We have Oriental Bittersweet that I think for the most part now, people really are not selling bittersweet wreaths and that type of thing. And that's, again, a good example of why it's illegal to transport this plant, is that we don't want the seeds scattered all along the way when people are transporting it, so that they've then establish themselves and we get large bittersweet stands. We all know bittersweet can take down trees. It's a miserable invasive. There's Japanese knotweed that is so tough. Its roots go 10 feet deep typically, maybe more, and it can come up through pavement. There's Norway Maple, which was introduced deliberately as a street tree and used extensively when a lot of the American elms started dying. And now we understand how invasive that can be in our New England landscapes and outcompete our sugar maples, our beautiful native sugar maples that we get maple syrup from. There is also garlic mustard, which is both of these photos at the top are the garlic mustard. And garlic mustard is a biennial with a 2-year life cycle. So this rosette of leaves here is the first year of garlic mustard after it germinates, and it doesn't flower like this until the second year. It's fairly easy to pull if you have it. There's Japanese barberry that was a popular horticultural plant for a long time that's now on the invasive list, Japanese honeysuckle, etc. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about invasive species per se. The regulations, the actual laws around this vary from state to state, but you can go to any number of websites, including the Grow Native Massachusetts website, and get linked to the Mass list, or you can Google it directly and learn what we do about this here in Massachusetts. So let's be sure we understand the terms that we're using. Native, again, means it's a species that's been present here through a long evolutionary process that has allowed it to be well adapted to all the other ecological parts of our system. Non-native is a plant that's been suddenly introduced by humans from a distant ecosystem. Naturalized does not mean native. So Queen Anne's lace, lilacs, calorie pears, for example, are all naturalized plants. Naturalized just means that plant is able to reproduce on its own without human help. But a lot of naturalized plants might also be invasive. Now, to be invasive, you have to be a plant that's gone in Massachusetts, that's gone through a very rigorous scientific analysis by the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group. And it's really documented of how much disruption that plant induces in our ecosystem. So calorie pear is not officially on the invasive list yet, but I suspect it will be soon. That's, again, a plant that was introduced as a fast-going tree with lovely spring flowers, but it is becoming a real danger and destroying a lot of ecosystem balance here in this area, and particularly further south. Okay, well, a lot of us like to have beautiful trees in our garden, including the dogwoods. And so why not buy that Cornus cusa, which is the Oriental dogwood, and plant that instead of our native Cornus florida? Because that's what a lot of nurseries will try to sell you. And the answer is simple. The Cornus cusa did not evolve here with the fauna of this ecosystem, so it doesn't host insects and arthropods. The Cornus florida did evolve here. So the Cornus florida hosts at least 117 species of moths and butterflies, which is actually a very good thing because the whole system has to work in order for us humans to even be able to live here. The Cornus cusa essentially doesn't host any insect life at all. And so in terms of ecosystem value, it has no value to the rest of the system. It's essentially, it's not a sterile plant. It can reproduce itself, but it is unhelpful to all the other life within our system. So the crux of native plants, and some of you may know this, many of you maybe have read some of the other Doug's book or other resources, but the crux of the issue is this. We can only eat because of plants, and any animal can only eat because of plants. Plants capture, they take the carbon dioxide in the air, they take water, they take the power of sunlight, and they turn carbon dioxide and water into carbon chain sugars that the rest of us eat. So they are the primary producers in the system that make food for the rest of the entire ecosystem, top to bottom. And for us for the fauna and us humans and all the rest of the animals in the system, there have to be intermediaries between the plants and ourselves. So the intermediaries are the insects. The first thing that will eat a plant before a bird eats it is an insect, or it's the insects that feed the salamanders, etc. So without insects, the rest of the system actually doesn't work at all. And our friend E.O. Wilson, the famous entomologist, puts it simply, without insects and arthropods, we have no food for birds, no salamanders and amphibians, no food web at all. Insects are the little things that run the world. And indeed, the number of species of insects is just astounding when you start to study it. It's they are the center of the universe, even though sometimes we humans think we are. So we call it a food web because it's complex in terms of all the many relationships of who's eating who. But some people call it a food chain, but it's just not a simple chain. And here we have a palm warbler, and of course, it's eating a caterpillar. And to keep the food web in balance, of course, we have insects that eat insects. So the spider eating the fly. And I think we all love our showcase birds like the great blue heron, and it's not eating insects, but it's eating the frog that just ate the insects. So this whole system is dependent on the insects being the intermediary between the plants and the rest of it. And E.O. Wilson sums it up this way. Again, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to a rich state of equilibrium from 10,000 years ago. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. So I know it's more accepted these days to understand how important insects are ecologically. There's a lot of attention to pollinators and those being important. Insects are important for so many reasons, but they are the hub of life. And Doug Tallamy, who I wish I could ask how many of you have heard of him. He's quite well known these days. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware. And back in 2007, he published his first book, Bringing Nature Home, which just catapulted him to national attention, certainly in the gardening, landscaping, ecological world. And he's the first person to have substantially documented the importance of native plants to insects and particularly to bird life. It's not that Doug discovered this for the first time. Certainly naturalists throughout the 19th and 20th century had talked about the importance of insects to bird life, but Doug and his graduate students have been studying this rigorously for decades and just come up with some amazing scientific papers and information about all of this. Doug's newest book, published just last year, Nature's Best Hope. I highly recommend both of these books. Really encapsulates this whole native plant issue about how we are losing the biodiversity on our planet. Life is declining. Populations are declining for so many birds, for so many of the migrating birds, particularly for our amphibians, for so many parts of the system. And as that biodiversity collapses, life collapses for human beings as well. So I really suggest reading his books. And the conclusion that he comes to through his scientific research is that native ornamental plants support 29 times the biodiversity than alien non-native ornamentals. So, and Doug further has done research in the last few years to try to measure, if we have a garden, how much of that garden needs to be native plants in order to actually at least maintain stable populations of native birds and other creatures and not have those populations continue to decline. And his very rough estimate is that about 70% of every landscape needs to be native to be headed towards at least sustaining biodiversity as we have it. If you go substantially under that, we're going to continue to lose biodiversity. And if you really make your landscapes native, then we might actually reverse some of the biodiversity declines that we're seeing. So the very first reason, and hugely essential reason to use native plants, is to stabilize our ecosystems and help reverse the biodiversity declines. But I want to talk a little bit about climate change as well, because we are all really starting to grapple with that issue, and it's a huge one. It turns out that native plants combined with an ecological approach to landscaping are also one of the elements that are really important to addressing climate change. And the beauty of this is these are things we can all do ourselves. We don't depend on, we are for climate change going to have to depend on many parts of the solution. But we can take really significant actions in our landscapes that will help address both of these issues. So we all know that the carbon dioxide that we humans are emitting into the atmosphere is increasing incredibly, particularly in the last 150 years. I don't think I need to review that. I think we all know that. We know about the rising mean global temperatures and ocean temperatures, the loss of glaciers and ice sheets, and sea level rise. So how can our native plant landscapes help that? Sometimes people say, you know, native plants don't need the care and maintenance that non-native plants do. And it's an oversimplification. The way I would put it is this: if you have the right plant adapted to your conditions, to your site, to your climate, yes, you can create gardens that don't need lots of inputs, that don't need chemical fertilizers to be sustained, that will thrive, and that, except for drought and extreme conditions, may not need watering at all. Again, that's a little bit of a tricky issue because of how much climate change is causing these abnormal weather patterns. But putting the right plant in the right place where it's well adapted goes a long way to ecologically starting to restore our system. And the other piece is that if you've got a garden where you've got the right plants that evolved in that type of landscape and are well suited to your site, you do not need to add chemical fertilizers at all. I've been gardening in my garden for 25 years, and I honestly can't even remember if I used chemical fertilizers in the beginning. I might have used some chemical superphosphates, which I don't use anymore either. But I certainly, for the vast majority of the time, I don't add fertilizer to my garden. I use the ecological processes that allow the soil to be restored and that allow these plants to grow and that have them adapted to my conditions. And the chemical fertilizer industry is a huge source of pollutants and of greenhouse gases. It actually is based on nitrogen production, and it really was spawned by the production of weapons in World War II. There was all this extra nitrous oxide that was being used, and it was discovered that, well, we could create these artificial fertilizers and sell them to the public. So there are tremendous environmental implications to using them that are not overall positive, and it's really great to just get away from a dependence at all on these chemical fertilizers. Now, by using ecological processes, what I mean is leave the leaf litter, let the soil replenish itself, plant an understory that's thick and dense so that you don't have to put mulch in to suppress weed growth. If you get your garden working in an ecological way, it actually saves time, money, and maintenance, and it's beautiful. This is a little section of my garden. And the plants, the perennials reemerge every year. I don't truck in mulch to suppress weed growth. I let the plants fill in all the spaces. I don't use leaf blowers, which are spouting carbon dioxide. The leaf litter comes down every year and decays, and the soil stays healthy. So if you think about our human impact on the landscape, which is huge, big pressures are the habitat fragmentation that we've caused by development, by dividing land into smaller and smaller parcels that break up wildlife corridors, and where we're introducing a lot of non-natives into our gardens and landscapes where before there was a native landscape. That's all contributing to the loss of biodiversity, to the extinctions that we've been talking about. And then climate change, of course, we know that 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have basically been in the last 2 decades. So again, these are huge issues that we have the power to make tremendous difference on. And just briefly, if you think about the impact of development in the United States, here's a map of housing density right before World War II in 1940, with red obviously being the most dense housing units per acre or per kilometer, however you want to measure it. And then here's 1960, 1990, and 10 years ago in 2010. And even in 2010, you can see that Massachusetts is almost all red. It's red halfway across the state. And so that means that we've got, at least 16 to well over 100 housing units per square kilometer. And we know what that landscape looks like. So we humans are occupying all of that landscape. And what we do is really the driver of ecosystem health. And that's why it's so important to understand that what we do matters, every garden matters, every landscape counts in making our ecosystem work well, in respecting it, and in helping, again, to reverse biodiversity loss and to help in our part to mitigate climate change. So from here on out, I want to, and the Every Garden Matters, every landscape out counts, by the way, is the Grow Native tagline, our motto in a succinct fashion. It's, we all make a difference. We want to do what we can to make sure that we live well in this world as one of the many creatures who are here in this very complex system. So we're going to take a look at my garden as a case study, and I've certainly gone through my own evolution over the years. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and thanks to Google Earth, we can zoom in. So here's my house in Cambridge, and we're zooming in near Fresh Pond. And I live on a neighborhood of 2-family houses on a lot, which is 7,300 square feet. And so that's a big lot for Cambridge, Massachusetts, but it might be a small lot for a lot of you out in New Hampshire or wherever you're from. And this is what it looked like when my husband and I bought it in 1992. It was what we call a fixer-upper. And my husband was the director of urban design for Cambridge, so he insisted that we live in Cambridge. And I had grown up on 100 acres and I wanted some land. I had never really gardened much because the 100 acres was right there, but I knew I wanted to have a beautiful landscape around me. This was the backyard in our little Cambridge 2-family. Again, but was really the wreck on the street. And then after maybe 10 or 15, probably I'd say this picture is about 15 years later, this is what where that garage was. And this is what it looks like now. And it's constantly evolving because succession happens. But I just want to say that I started out with a conventional, I think, view of gardening. We all of a sudden, we had this wreck of a house. We had basically no money to invest in the house other than putting in heat and hot water, but plants are cheaper. And we took down that awful old garage and started to create a landscape. And we did what almost every gardener does. We went to the nursery, we looked at the catalog, we said, what looks pretty? What do I like for color? What's in my cold hardiness zone? I did not have a plan or a philosophy to guide me in what I was trying to create at that time. That was, 1993 when we started. But what happened for me was that in the 90s, I started to become aware of the invasive plant issue. And that's when that issue was really rising in the public consciousness. And I got rid of the major invasives, the 10 major invasives on our property. And I started planting more natives. And as I planted more natives, other nice things started to happen. So I'm going to give you just a quick tour of some of my favorite plants in the garden. That cluster of trees right there are Shad Bush, also known as Amelanchius species. And they're commonly called Shad Bush or Shad Blow because they bloom when the shad are running in the streams. They're also called Juneberry because they have their nice red berries in June. And their other common name is Serviceberry because they bloom when the ground would thaw enough so that the colonists could bury their dead. But it's a beautiful, there's several species of Amelanchius, and they're beautiful native tree, really. One of my favorite understory spring ephemerals in the garden is bloodroot, which spreads stoloniferously. It's much like a crocus in that the leaves open up with the sun. After they've opened up for a few days and been pollinated by those early spring insects that arrive, the plants drop their petals. And then only then do the leaves start to unfurl into these beautiful, beautiful leaves that make such a nice ground cover as the year unfolds. Another favorite understory ground cover plant, and you'll notice the leaf litter is really, all these ephemerals, spring ephemerals are coming up through the leaf litter in my garden. Ovularius Silifolia is a beautiful, again, small, about 4 or 5 inches tall understory plant that spreads stoloniferously. Here it is mixed with a little anemonella. Here's the bloodroot leaves. Here are the bloodroot leaves after they've opened fully and mixed in with some geranium and some yellow lady slipper. Here's a close-up of the yellow lady slipper. This is a species of lady slipper that can be cultivated and can be produced without being harvested from the wild. So if you want to have lady slippers in your garden, please purchase them from a grower. Do not try to take them from the woods because they won't transplant anyway. You'll just be killing them off. Phlox stolonifera is a great understory plant. Here's the floor of my garden. Again, once probably in June, as it has come up through that leaf litter and through the understory and established itself for the growing season. Mixed in is some jack-in-the-pulpit, and as well as jack-in-the-pulpit, I have Trillium. And Trillium are really, both Trillium and jack-in-the-pulpit are amazing native plants, beautiful flowers of their own right. In each case of these two species, the seed, when it first germinates, has to go through at least 1, if not 2 winters of cold stratification. So in the case of the jack-in-the-pulpit, this is the fall plant that has gone to seed. And when it drops its seed, it'll be 1 or 2 years before that plant germinates at all. And when it germinates, it's going to be a little teeny plant that first year, just maybe not even an inch tall. In the case of both Trillium and jack-in-the-pulpit, they have to go through 5 to 7 years of reemerging after every winter's cold and senescence and growing a little bit bigger each year before they even flower for the first time. So this, again, notice the leaf litter, that if I had disturbed that leaf litter, they wouldn't be reproducing and I wouldn't get to see them at all. But because I'm letting that system work, I'm getting these beautiful native wildflowers as part of my understory. Another plants that go well together because they're both a little bit aggressive if they're in conditions that you like are mayapple and sensitive fern. Here I have the back garden that with a big rainfall gets wet. And here's what they look like when they come up together. It's just a nice mixture. I really love our native azaleas. This is a rhododendron vasei, and they're harder to find in the nursery trade, but they are just beautiful plants that I think have an aesthetic that's lovely with our woodland species. And they are great because they're native plants. This particular species is not native to Massachusetts. It's native a little bit further south up here. That's fine with me. I don't see that as a problem. I do think overall our native rhododendrons are underutilized. I love the Cornus florida. I mentioned that before. The Cornus florida is our beautiful native American dogwood. This happens to be a pink variant of it. And the Cornus florida produce these wonderful berries in the fall that are full of fat. They're very high in fat content and great for migrating birds. Here's a mixture of ostrich fern in the back, Viburnum dentatum, and Tiarella cordifolia in the front. Again, just a range of species that do well together. One of our great shrubs here in New England, very native to this area, and I'm sure where you guys are in Nashua as well, is summer sweet or Clethra olifolia. This is a great plant because of that wonderful smell it gets when it's blooming in July. In the woods, in the woodlands, it likes to have its feet wet, and it will often be seen as an understory plant along the edges of lakes or in slightly swampy areas where it gets enough light. and it's a beautiful garden plant. It's actually turns out to be quite adaptable to even moderate garden conditions where it doesn't have water all the time. So that's, some plants are more generalist plants and adaptable to a wider variety of conditions than others. And as we work with any native species, we learn which ones are well adapted to the range of conditions that we might have. In the fall, clethra has beautiful seed heads that are just, again, valuable for insects, I'm sure, and also beautiful in the landscape. Here's a little section of my back garden that has a mixture of blue lobelia, which is the flowering plant. It has some gray dogwood at the back. There's some high bush blueberry, some native grasses, etc. And the trunks you're seeing are a river birch. And this is an area where I'm often going to see lots of birds and happy things going on. Witch hazel is a nice small tree, tall shrub. Some people call it a shrub, some people call it a tree. The Hamamillus virginiana is the native witch hazel. There are a lot of non-native witch hazels sold in the nursery trade. Hummingbird Virginiana blooms in November. And so it can be wonderful when you have snowfall coming down to see this flowering, beautiful yellow flowering tree just cheering up the landscape. Fall color. A high bush blueberry is one of our great plants for fall color. Vaccinium corymbosum. A lot of people say, you know, what's a burning bush is on the prohibited plant list here in Massachusetts. And what could I plant in addition? If you have the right conditions, I mean, the blueberries all like sandy conditions. I have clay soil, so they're not super happy in my garden. This particular high bush blueberry, I actually put in a pot by the back door just because I like the structure of the bark and the color of the leaves so much, and kept that alive for probably at least 7-8 years and just let it overwinter in the pot outside, and just made a really nice potted plant up by the house. Ceanothus americanus is another plant that's increasingly being used. It's a very tough plant. It takes clay soil, which I have a lot of. It's a great plant for pollinators. It attracts many pollinators in the spring. Our winter berries, Ilex verticillata, here is being visited by the honeybee. Winter berries are dioecious, so you need a male and a female plant for it to berry. The berries in the fall are much loved by birds, particularly if they're straight species winter berries. And they just very valuable to many different insects and pollinators as well. So I think we can sum up 3 great reasons for using native plants. And I really want to emphasize that the fact that they're beautiful and really belong in our gardens is just a good reason to use them as the really important ecological reasons of biodiversity and climate change. Now, in that landscape that I showed you, the 7,300 square feet that comprises my gardens, I have over 120 native species of plants at this point. I have a very few non-native species left. I'm not advocating that any of you go and try to have that many species. I'm a plantaholic and I admit it. And so I can't resist trying new things. And I've learned so much over the years. I would advocate trying to migrate your landscape to be as native as much as possible. You can do it a bit at a time, but every step you take in that direction really, really is important. And also massing plants is really important. And so having, if a species is well adapted to your particular conditions and site, use it generously, because that's going to actually have more impact on birds and wildlife than just planting one of this and one of that and one of that. And I want to talk about birds for a little bit, because I'm a real bird lover. And birds are a really great indicator species for the health of our landscapes. And even though I can't see you all, and I wish I could, I'm betting that many of you in this audience are bird lovers as well. And they're what gets me very excited about my garden. And what's really just so sad is that there was a major report done in 2016 that inventoried the viability of all the bird species in North America, the approximately 1,400 species of birds all across North America. And the large picture for birds is that over 1/3, well over 1/3 of the bird species in North America are at high risk of major population loss or extinction. And another very significant number, up to about 2/3 of all birds, are at some level of population decline and risk. And it's not quite as dire if you just take the New England species, but it's still a pretty dire picture. So the birds who are most affected by these population declines are often our migratory birds, the ones that, like this wood thrush, that migrates twice a year, spends its winter in the Central America, and migrates thousands of miles back up to New England to summer and breed. So think about how many migratory species do this, and they're the songbird species that I think a lot of us love so much, that just are beautiful. And in the case of the wood thrush, it doesn't even weigh 2 ounces. It's barely more than a letter that you might put in the post office to mail. And it nests on low branches, so it's very vulnerable to predation. It depends on eating insects, and it forages largely on the ground as its food source. And if we don't have leaf litter, which we largely don't anymore, it doesn't find anything to eat. And it depends on the protection of an understory of shrubs and places where it can't get eaten by predators, cats and other things. So it's not surprising that this is a species that is actually on the watch list at this point for extinction. And its populations are so low that we may lose it entirely. I have actually had wood thrushes in my garden. I've had quite a few. Well, I've had at least the 4 major species of thrushes. And overall in my garden, I don't know if you can guess in your heads how many species I may have documented in the last decade using my garden of that Cambridge, Massachusetts place that, the house occupies 1/3 of the site and the rest of the 2/3 are the garden, which is, pretty rich at this point. I've recorded actually 81 species of bird using the habitat on my property in Cambridge. And that just gets me super excited and has convinced me that if I can do this, we can all do this. And it's so important. Now, I don't expect to see 81 species every year. That's a count. I don't have the time to sit in the backyard on my back porch or in my garden all spring and document all of them. So these are actually observations based on when I'm able to not be at my desk and spend time outside. But I would expect or hope to see over half of those species every year. And of the total 81 species recorded, 45 are neotropical migrants, most of which are in decline, in population decline. And so I'm really proud to be helping them. And I've actually had both wood thrush and sorry, losing it. American woodcocks. Well, you see ovenbirds, all kinds of warblers, and it's just great. So, why do I get this many species in my small garden in Cambridge? And the answer is, I think, an answer we can all give. We all know, what do we all need? Every single one of us needs a place to live and food to eat. That's the essence of life, and that's the essence of what those birds need. So here's a kingbird hanging out in the garden looking for insects in the spring. Here's a red-bellied woodpecker also foraging for insects on the side of a silver maple. Here's a Wilson's warbler. And what I love there is the Wilson's warbler is in those Amelanchier trees that I showed in the beginning. And you notice it's not actually eating a berry because the berries are not ripe yet. This is before the berries ripen. But if you look, you see that it's actually eating a caterpillar. So my native Amelanchier is feeding it insects, which is that whole connection that we talked about. Here are the white-throated sparrows that do that little back and forth dance, and that's how they stir up insects at the ground level and find insects to eat. Here's a veery, which is one of the thrushes in the thrush family. Here's a northern water thrush. I mentioned that my back garden floods when we get these larger rainfalls. So I've even had northern water thrush stop by. A scarlet tanager, which again is very much a bird that likes to nest more in deeper woodlands, but it was migrating through and it stopped by and found some food in my garden. Robins, of course. Robins are a very generous bird. They're one of the species whose populations are not declining. Gray catbirds, hummingbirds at cardinal flower. Hummingbirds actually eat insects, and they love cardinal flower for the nectar. So they have that fantastic tongue that comes out and goes after the nectar. American goldfinches, which here are eating the seeds of a thuya, or people know it as arborvitae. This is in early December, and they eat the seeds every year. I have our local red-tailed hawks that I wish would eat more of the squirrels, etc. So that just gives you a flavor of some of what I've been able to see in my garden. And as I said, you know, a lot of why the richness is happening is that my garden is almost all native plants. And so you can see here 2 examples of insects that are just hanging out, and they're probably going to be bird food in relatively short order. So in addition to the 2 things that are making my garden so healthy, in addition to being largely native plants, are also the understory leaf litter, the ground, that whole healthy system working as a whole that is bringing these results. Well, I want to tell you one more bird story before wrapping up into working with natives and a few other tips if you want to do more of it yourself. This is the back garden, and I have planted trees and taken down trees and had actually planted this tree here, this river birch, next to a silver maple, which I wanted to take down because that was an aesthetic decision. I didn't want the silver maple in the middle of the yard. So I had planted the river birch as a replacement tree in effect. But as it came time to take down the last trunk of the silver maple, this was probably, oh my gosh, would have been about a little over 10 years ago. I was so into the habitat native plant issue that I said, well, rather than taking that trunk all the way down, I want to leave it as a snag and see if I can create habitat for woodpeckers to nest. And I had to work on my husband a little bit because he wasn't thrilled with the idea of creating a snag, but I prevailed. And he was worried it would look ugly. And yet, you know, this is the way it looked in the growing season. You didn't really see that it wasn't a naturally occurring beautiful snag off in the woods. And it really actually had its own quality, aesthetic quality in the garden. And the amazing thing is that my experiment worked. It was just incredible. So this is 2013. This was 5. So I created the snag in 2008, must have been. And we were sitting on the back porch in April 6th. And all of a sudden I looked back into that part of the garden and I'm like, oh my God, my experiment's working. So here's a male downy woodpecker, which you can tell because of the red patch on the back of his head. And he obviously had not just started drilling that hole. He had been working on it for days. And when he flew away for a few minutes, the flicker came by, and northern flicker, and checked it out. But Mr. Downey came back, and he worked hard on and off for generally several hours a day. And it took him 2 weeks to get this far into the trunk. So this trunk was about 5 years into its decay. It was pretty hard on the outside, and I think it was a lot softer in the inside. Finally, after 2 weeks of work, I love this because I love how he's bracing with his tail the way woodpeckers do. Finally, after 2 weeks of work, he got in, and the hole was big enough that he popped out, and it was like, oh, he's finally getting in there. He's finally creating. They actually create a good size they excavate a good sized hole inside to lay their eggs and have their young grow. And then the female came by. And so this was April 21st. And she seems to be kind of inspecting the hole. And the reliable resources I have say that the male and the female share the nest building. But I will say, in this case, in my observation, the male did more of the work. And then I saw them flutter together, which was mating. And it got very quiet for a number of weeks. And I honestly didn't know if they had successfully laid eggs and were raising a brood of babies, because it was really quiet. And whatever back and forth flying they were doing, they were very surreptitious. It was quite remarkable. But as time went on, it started to get noisier, and I started to see both adults flying back and forth quite regularly. So this is May 31st. It's 6 weeks since we first observed the hole, and the actual laying of the eggs and incubating of the eggs takes a couple of weeks. And then the young take generally about at least 3 weeks to grow up enough to be large enough to fledge. And back to the importance of insects and caterpillars, what were mom and dad flying with back and forth to the nest? But if you look in here, you'll see there's a wad of caterpillars, probably about 8 caterpillars in there. And they have the woodpeckers have a barbed tongue they can pick them up with, so they can get multiple caterpillars in one trip back and forth. And they're feeding this little one. We heard all this youngster, baby woodpecker noises and whining and complaining going on in the nest. And this guy, this is a male, you can't see it in this photo, but he also has the red spot. He's hanging out of the nest and he's begging for food, and mom and dad are feeding him. And then after a few days, mom and dad stopped feeding him quite so much and just hung out. And he kept pushing himself further out of the hole and whining and complaining quite a lot, the way a lot of, I think, adolescents do. And then on June 1st at 3:29 p.m., 6 weeks since I think I saw the mating, he thrust himself out of the hole, grabbed the side of the tree. He actually flew over to those Amelanchier trees, and he was swinging in the breeze, so he wasn't very comfortable there, and he wasn't really able to eat those green berries. So he flew to the trunk of the Chemacypris tree in the middle of my garden, and he just hung there quietly for a little bit. And think of this guy, he's just like gotten himself out of the nest and he flies. It's quite remarkable. And then he slowly climbed up the trunk of the tree, eating insects that he gleaned from the trunk of the tree all the way as he went up. And then 12 minutes after fledging, literally 12 minutes, he flew out of the yard. And it's, there's a joke when I get to see you all and be in the same room, my joke is how many of you are parents and how many of you would like to be downy woodpeckers? Not all woodpeckers have their young fledge and fly off onto their own that quickly, but the downies do. And it was really amazing to watch this whole thing happen. And then still in the nest was this young female. And we had these very creative names for the two of them as we were watching them, trying to feed and get the caterpillars. It was Big Brother and Little Sister. Little Sis obviously had been sat on by her big brother. She had a weaker voice. She was kind of, but her parents also stopped feeding her so much. And after a few days, I'd just been out for a meeting and I was checking the nest all the time. And I came back into the garden and I knew she was gone. And then I heard her high up in the tree and I saw her, and she hung out for about half an hour, and then she too flew off. So again, if I can create habitat for nesting downy woodpeckers in a relatively small garden in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think that's just emblematic of what we can all do. And if you want to create habitat for birds, there's a few principles. Vertical edge, which means big trees, high tree canopy, layers, mid-tree canopy, shrub layers. All of those tend to be inhabited by somewhat different species depending on their habitat requirements. And again, this is the complexity of any ecosystem, that no species, all the species can't use the same habitat. So they evolve for all these different types of ways of feeding and places where they nest and places that are suited to how they live. Water is important. If you have water that you supply, make sure that there are no cats around for predation. The biggest killers of birds are cats, glass buildings, and probably pesticides. Provide lots of cover in your garden for privacy, for protection, for nesting. And snags, great believer in snags, decaying matter, leaf litter, and please no pesticides. So again, here are the reasons why native plants are so important. And I don't have a long time to go into talking about working with native plants, but I do want to talk a little bit about it. Keys to success. I would say if I were to go back and do anything differently in my garden, I would have done with what I know now, 25 years ago, or whatever, however long ago it was, I would have wanted to have done a better job understanding my soil and site conditions before I started choosing the species and creating the big idea for what type of habitat I was creating. I did a lot of learning on the fly, learning on the go, but I have clay soil, and they in fact used to make a lot of the bricks for New England in this part of Cambridge, and really appreciating that to start with. And studying the plant species I was interested, particularly the trees and shrubs that I would want to use as the anchors for my garden, and the structure that it would begin to create would be to really figure out what's really well adapted to that soil. And then also to start to think about plant communities. What grows together because they're adapted, and there are these complex relationships, even soil relationships, which we don't understand super well. So taking the time to research my plants and to learn and to read books and to study all of those things. I mean, there was less knowledge about this 25 years ago, but all of those things are really worth your time. And there are lots of great books that I find very fun to peruse. And then really understanding, and again, it's very ironic that I'm trained as a biologist, worked as an environmental educator, work as really in the ecological field. But 25 years ago, I didn't really understand that my garden is an ecological system, and now I do. And now I know that I can work with that system and actually take advantage of what it teaches me and of the cycles that are there. So those are my three biggest pieces of advice. Again, here's talking about the leaf litter one more time. This is would be probably early April, late March. And you'll see that all those perennials and the ephemerals are starting to come up through the leaf litter. And it's just so great because it's delivered one leaf at a time, free in the fall. I try to find time to go bicycling. It's there in the spring. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay for it. And it makes that soil really healthy and really rich, so you don't need chemical fertilizers. The other thing, and someday I'm going to do a whole program just on leaf litter, because there is so much life in leaf litter that's beautiful and that is part of our ecological system. And here are just three simple examples. The hummingbird moth, there are several species of hummingbird moth here in New England. When it pupates and spins its cocoon so that it can reproduce, it does so in the leaf litter. So if we take up the leaf litter, or even if we grind up the leaf litter and chop it up, we're preventing that hummingbird moth from reproducing. Everybody loves pollinators these days, and bumblebees. And there are, I think, 11 species of bumblebees in Massachusetts, a number of which are declining quite a bit. There's only a few whose populations are stable or more common. But in all the bumblebee species, the queen, which is the only one to survive the winter, if the queen doesn't survive the winter, there will be no more bumblebees next year. The queen hibernates in the ground, typically, sort of tucked in just like very much at the top of the soil under the leaf litter. And that's what protects the queen from getting to next year and having the next year's bumblebee populations. And what's so totally remarkable is that this morning cloak butterfly here is one of the butterfly species that actually overwinters as an adult in the leaf litter. So we talked a little bit earlier about butterfly populations, and it is true that the male and the female butterflies, once they do mate and the female lays the eggs, the adult butterflies do die. But in the life cycle of the morning cloak, the male and the female have to survive the winter as adults in that leaf litter. And if you ever see one in the spring that's a little tattered, you have appreciation for what it must go through to survive. So finally, let me just direct you to some more resources to help you with, everyone always wants to know what to plant. And I can never just give that advice because I would really have to understand your site and your conditions and what you are trying to achieve. But I am the founder of Grow Native Massachusetts, and our goal is to inspire you to action on behalf of native plants and the diversity of life they support. And I think your garden counts just as much as mine. And so I hope that this has helped to do that. At Grow Native, we built, mostly I built, the website that's there. That's one of my key roles still today, even though I'm retired from the board, is a really fantastic website with so many resources for you. And if I have a minute after I'm done with the presentation, I'll demo it. But under this first tab here, Know Your Landscape, we have a whole lot of pages to talk about the importance of native plants, invasive plants, plant terminology, the whole premise of ecological approach to gardening. And then particularly under the Great Resources tab, we have gazillions of books that we recommend and videos and downloadable articles. So I know somebody asked in the beginning, what kind of resources would this talk give you to use for the future? And there's just a million resources. Well, I don't know if it's a million. There are hundreds of resources on the Grow Native Massachusetts website. And then finally, if you've enjoyed this talk, I now am doing more and more of these talks. I've done hundreds of them around, over 100 around New England. And this is more of the general overview introduction to why native plant landscaping is so important. But certainly I welcome you to explore my website as well at claudiagthompson.com. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm also going to just give you a very quick demo of the Grow Native website. So I'm going to go back and hopefully you can all see the website now. I don't know, Carol, if you can let me know if that's showing properly.
It looks good to me.
All right. So under Know Your Landscape here is where I was saying we have a whole lot of pages that really are sort of issue-oriented pages, further education about the issue. I highly recommend exploring those to the extent that they're helpful. And then what I was mentioning was this tab, the Great Resources tabs, and I'll just take you through it a tiny bit. The best books. So here's about 40 or 45 books that we think are all really excellent books. We wouldn't put them up if they weren't. We give you a little background information about what each book is about, so that if you're saying, I need a book about X, then you can see what we recommend to start with and see what your lovely library has, or what you might want to consider either ordering for yourself if you're so inclined. And we also have a page on what we think are the best databases for learning. So if I'm studying plants and thinking about plants for my garden, I really like a book that I can peruse, because if I'm learning about species and don't already know what I want to use, it's seeing the combination of pictures and reading the descriptions and being able to flip through pages in that old-fashioned way that I find much easier than scanning a website. If I know what species I'm really thinking of using, that's for me where the websites get more valuable. So I might go to this page and say, okay, what are the best websites for learning about plants and animals? Here's what we think are some of the best websites for different reasons. Websites about invasive plants, what we think are the best bird and butterfly websites, etc. We also have a page of articles and downloads. Again, these are both articles about the issue where you can download them and print them yourself. There are plant lists for a number of situations. There are some primers, reports, and tips and fact sheets all organized. And our databases, our website is searchable as well, so you can put in topics that you're interested in. Like if you said, I really want to learn about landscaping for birds, and then you put that in there, it would give you the most useful info just for that. We have nurseries and seed sources. This page is the single most used page on our website and has been so since we were founded, since I founded us 10 years ago. Literally from day one, people, if you're working with native plants, you already know that they can be hard to source. There's no single nursery that's going to have everything you want. So we've got, again, a list of close to 50 different sources of native plants all around New England, and a few options for ordering plugs or seeds from other parts that aren't local here to Massachusetts. Finally, I would direct you to everything in this section, but we have we do Evenings with the Experts lecture series, which we've done for 10 years and had speakers like Doug Tallamy and Bill Kalina, who is well known for his books, and Rob Jagir, who's one of the best bee experts in Massachusetts, and Larry Weiner, who's one of the best ecological thinker, gardener, landscapers in really the Eastern United States, if not the United States. So all of our programs here link to a professionally edited video of these speakers' talks. And I think you'll find those useful as well. So lots of things for you to explore, some pages specifically related to Massachusetts. And what I would like to do now is take as many questions as I can.
Okay, let's see. Yes, we have a lot. First of all, what are the best native plants for sandy soil?
Well, since I don't have sandy soil, then my information is going to come from some of these other sources, not having as much personal gardening experience with them. But I would say go to those great resources pages, because there are going to be lists on there. And also just thinking back to the website for a minute, there is actually just come out, there's a group in Southeastern Mass called the Southeastern Mass Pine Barrens Alliance. Actually, I can share this real quickly again, if that makes sense. So there's this Southeastern Mass Cape and Islands, which is a very sandy soil region. And on that page on the website are a whole bunch of organizations that would have plant lists that are particularly relevant to those types of conditions. So if you're talking about sandy soil up in a slightly colder climate, a lot of those species will be relevant. I would start there, and then I would also look on those other pages of the website that I was sharing.
Okay, we have a couple questions about the leaf litter. Somebody asked, can plants grow up through oak leaves? And someone else asked, are some types of leaves better for leaf litter? A landscaper once told me that leaving oak leaves in my butterfly garden prevented rain from reaching the soil.
Oh. Was this landscaper making money by taking up your leaves?
Yeah.
Leaf litter is not going to prevent rain from reaching your soil. There are so many areas where we often see oak pine forest growing together, and I think most of us can picture that. And one of the most beautiful native small wildflowers is so well adapted to coming up through that forest floor, and it's Myanthemum canadense. It's a little teeny, some people call it the native lily of the valley. Lily of the valley is a much larger plant. It's actually quite aggressive. I consider lily of the valley invasive. It is not specifically on the mass prohibited plant list, but it will outcompete all the native wildflowers. The very small plant that comes up in the spring that looks a little bit similar and has this upright leaf is Mianthemum canadense. And if you look at a forest floor that's oak and pine, and you see it in the spring, you will often see this beautiful green carpet of Mianthemum canadense. So a lot of our native perennials will come up through particularly mixed leaf litter like oak and pine, which grows together. You know, if you go back to the systems approach, in general, you wouldn't see woodlands that are, you will see woodlands that have a lot of oak in them, but they'll have a mixture. And so if you go back to this plant community approach and say, well, okay, where we have oaks, what other trees do they grow with? Then you can say what kind of other plants grow in that plant community. Those species are all going to be quite well adapted. Now, there may be some species that would have a harder time coming up through leaf litter. Although in general, I haven't experienced that. But again, I would say, think about the plant communities. In my garden, oak leaves do take longer to break down than some other species. There's no doubt about that. But there are many hundreds of species that would be adapted to growing through that. What I would say is if you were to import leaves and artificially make that layer unduly thick, then you can suppress plant growth. But your goal to work ecologically is to have the system that is maintaining itself. And so let's say if you take an oak leaves in your leaf litter of mixed whatever it is, because it's probably not going to be solid oak leaves unless you had nothing but oak leaves growing in an area. And then thinking about the woods, you probably tend to have certain grasses and understory grasses that are adapted to that, along with the Mianthemum canadense. But you might find, if you were doing an analysis of your soil, remnants of oak leaves. My leaves, if my Amelanchier leaves, and I have the neighbor has a cherry, and I have the birch, and I have one neighbor has, unfortunately, Norway Maple. Those all get totally broken down within the year. So the cycle in my garden is by next spring, it's only going to be last year's leaves that haven't been broken down. For oak leaves, it may take a 2-year cycle and there may still be residue of it. But if your soil's healthy and if all the critters, and there are many critters in there that are eating the leaves and munching them and helping them all break down, you should not artificially need to chop them up, and you should be able to create a beautiful garden that allows that ecological process to work without removing them. It is true that if you have lawn, you do need to remove the leaves to preserve the lawn. I would just suggest keeping your lawn area relatively small because lawn doesn't have a lot of ecological value. What I do with the small amount of lawn that I have is, take those leaves off there, and I do add some of them to a shrubby area in the back, or I have some compost bins where I save some of them for mixing with my vegetable compost, so you can mix your browns with your greens and all of that.
Right. Good. Okay, we had a couple questions about bittersweet. Let's see, one person saying, is there any hope to get rid of it? And another person saying, we recently moved and removed Oriental Bittersweet along the stone wall on the edge of the property. How do we now start to turn that into a native garden?
Well, good for all of you for getting rid of the bittersweet, because bittersweet is a really destructive, invasive, and I am not at all opposed to do a responsible use of glyphosate for the careful cut stem applications that need to be done if you've got big stumps of bittersweet where you've been removing these really thick vines. There is no other way you can stop it from continuing to grow. In my experience, I know bittersweet well enough that I recognize the small plants where birds have eaten a seed somewhere else and they've dropped it in my garden, and that bittersweet is sprouting. And, you know, if you pull it when it's not bigger than this tall, or maybe a foot tall, you can pull it by hand. But whenever it gets bigger than that, you have to have either a weed wrench, which is a tool that uses lever and is very good at pulling out the roots, or any bittersweet that gets bigger. There's no way to get rid of it other than doing a very careful cut stem application of an herbicide. That said, I suppose, I mean, literally, if you were able to totally prevent it from regrowing for 5 to 10 years, you might suppress it and kill it that way. In terms of what you should use to reestablish, it's whatever is adapted. So if it's a stone wall, oh my gosh, there's so many species that I would love to have that kind of could seed themselves in, and, you know, depending on what you've got to the side. There are some plants like columbines that Aquilegia canadensis, the beautiful red flower. There are certain species that actually kind of like to seed themselves in the cracks between the rocks. So look for those types of things if it's kind of at the front edge of the wall. Look, again, it's a little hard to picture the site, but figure out what's adapted to, if there's water draining through, then you need something that's both, I mean, stones, depending on how the wall is constructed, can actually hold a certain amount of water. But if it's a dry stone wall where you're losing a lot of water, it might be slightly different.
Okay, here's a couple of kind of related questions. Tess is saying, in the suburbs, many people consider native gardening messy, and some even complain about people not picking up leaf litter and not using commercial mulch. Any thoughts on changing their minds? And then there's another one. Matthew is saying, have your neighbors been influenced to create similar habitats to yours?
Yeah, no,
Peer pressure.
Yeah, those are such good questions. I will say that when I founded Grow Native 11 years ago, we were founded out of a group of neighbors. I mean, I didn't actually intend to start a nonprofit. It was right after the economy crashed in 2008, and I had actually stepped down from a very demanding job where I was working more than 12 hours a day and happy to have a little time off. And then the economy crashed. And so I had a little more free time than I'd had. And I decided to start organizing some neighborhood workshops. And there were enough neighbors interested that, you know, they joined in. And I said, well, let's teach people about invasives. And we'd grab a wheel there and we'd go up and down the street and just, you know, find the invasives that were all there and start to teach people about them. So there was definitely a good interest within my block. I had a fantasy, I admit, that I can convince everybody in my block to adopt this ethic, and that we would all get together and make our entire block in Cambridge native, and we'd have this massive bird life coming through. And there are definitely people who are quite resistant to this. And I'm very careful because I did come to be known as the native plant lady in the neighborhood. You know, the neighbors that didn't want to do that would, oh, I don't want advice from her. But other neighbors would really want it. So my sense is we need to find the receptivity wherever it is. And there are a lot of people that are curious. And, you know, kids would love to have a garden where they find birds and caterpillars and all kinds of things. So building on people's curiosity, I think, is important. What was the first part of the question, Carol? There was something else I wanted to...
about neighbors thinking, you know, you should be cleaning up your leaves.
Oh, right. The messy thing. The messy thing. Yeah. There definitely is a mindset and aesthetic in the traditional landscaping world that's really kind of perverse. I had a dream once that I might do a slideshow where I show a beautiful dried fall foliage of the flowers that have gone by, and there's snow on it. And you can imagine that picture on the calendar, and it would look beautiful. And everyone would say, oh, isn't that a beautiful landscape? And then you'd show the totally chopped down garden with nothing going on and just mulch on the ground, and put them side by side and say, which is more beautiful? You know, and I would bet to you that if you had a calendar like that, or you put those two pictures side by side and ask people to say, which of these landscapes is more beautiful? and you had it just as photographs like that. I've got to do this experiment, because I would bet you that at least 90% of the time, the people would take the kind of winter landscape with the fallen stems and the snow on the seed heads and say that's more beautiful. And yet, the craziness that somehow we're not supposed to do that.
Right.
So I don't know the particular situation of the person who asked the question, but what a lot of people would advise is, if you've got finicky neighbors or you're part of a finicky homeowner association, part of it is educating people and getting them to, walk and see what they enjoy. But also, if the very edges of your garden or your property are mowed, sometimes that's enough to make people feel like you've got a neatness factor there.
Right.
Again,
it's not neglect, it's planning. Right.
And there are ways to, in my garden, the front is, I should have a good picture of the front. I actually still have about 400 non-native bulbs in the spring. And I planted them before I was so excited about really primarily using natives. And then it's spectacular. There's a month in March into April where everybody comes by and goes, "Oh my God, it's so beautiful." And then they senesce, and the rest of what comes up in my front garden are all native plants, and I leave them a little sloppy and let them do their thing, because it's food for insects and it's valuable ecologically. And maybe having, just a little bit of that, people knowing me and having that in the spring, I don't know, maybe that helps.
Right. Here's a good one. Can you recommend any native plants that bunnies won't eat? We have some bunnies who ate much of my garden last year. The same problem.
Again, I'm having the same issue. The number of rabbits in Cambridge are really significant, and sometimes I'm surprised at what they do eat. I would say a lot of I'm thinking of the nurseries, and even though I don't know if we have I'm trying to remember if we have a rabbit resistant list expressly on the website now. I need to check that. But a lot of the books and references that are up there do have in their appendices plants that are broken down by deer resistant, rabbit resistant, all that. So I would say search the resources we have. I know, I'm trying to think about the nurseries that we have. Nurseries are getting better and better about listing these, and I don't have the best ones right off the top of my head, but some of the nurseries are very good at giving all kinds of codes for their plants as to which are deer resistant, which are rabbit resistant. And so you could, for example, go to the Van Berkom website. If you're not a wholesaler, please don't call them. They'll be really unhappy. There's a complexity of our nursery pages. We have retail nurseries and wholesale nurseries, and they're not completely isolated, but generally a nursery that's a grower and is selling wholesale to landscapers and to other garden centers can't deal with the individual customer, and you just get them upset if you take tons of their time, because they're very small staffed operations working really hard, and they can't accommodate a retail customer. But on the other hand, some of them have very good websites that are open to you for looking up that kind of information. And I think that one of them is New Moon Nursery. And so I'm just checking to make sure. Again, they only sell plugs, and they will only sell to landscapers and professionals. But their plant list is fantastic. And so you can look up those kinds of things. So try exploring the various nursery pages, both retail and wholesale, and the resources on some of the books and some of the databases that we have as well. One of my favorite databases is the Missouri Plant Finder, the Missouri Botanical Garden database, for just looking up about individual species, as well as the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, which is the National Native Plant Organization. And they have a Plant Finder database as well. And that has that kind of information for sure. Sorry, that was long-winded, but.
And this is probably a good one for New Hampshire. Is there value to pine needles in building biodiversity?
Oh my God. I would give my IT. I'll take any pine needles you don't want, I will take.
Okay.
Absolutely. They're great soil enrichers and part of the ecological process as they break down just the way the leaves of deciduous plants are. I really personally covet a lot of the plants that grow in slightly acid soil, which pines tend to be. And so again, if you're working with understory shrubs and plants and you have pines that are adapted to those type of lower pH soil conditions, there are so many beautiful native plants that you can grow in those conditions that actually I can't grow as well in my clay conditions. But when I was working to try to really get my front garden to be healthier, I went to a friend who had she was out in Concord, Mass, and she had tons of extra pine needles on her driveway. And I collected 8 or 10 yard waste bags full of them and used them as the mulch for my new plantings, because they made a beautiful, beautiful mulch for all these new plantings. The one time I do use mulch is sometimes if I'm putting in a new planting and I want to suppress the weeds there until the plant material, all the species grow in thick enough to essentially be the entire understory there. And the pine needles were fabulous. And actually a lot of companies sell pine needles as mulch now and ship them across the country, which is also kind of unecological, but I love your pine needles.
Yeah. Okay. And then Tessa's asking, she says, I have an organic vegetable garden and plant many heirloom varieties. Is there such a thing as native vegetables?
Well, a lot of the agricultural crops that we grow are not native. Tomatoes are native to North America. It's interesting that we think of them in Italian food, but when you think about our agricultural crops, they've all been shared around the globe by now, all over. And there are some edible, I'm trying to think of what good leafy edible natives would be. There is, I think it's on our books. I'm pretty positive. Hang on while I check. I mean, there are certainly lots of native plants that have edible berries, blueberries. Service berries are edible to humans, but I guarantee you, if you have service berries, the birds will get them first. I'm trying to see, but there is a book, maybe it's not on our website. There is a book by Russ Cohen, which I guess
Russ Cohen, we're having him come speak in May about
so Russ Cohen is Mr. Edible.
Yes.
And go to his talk. And I actually should put his book on here.
I think it's maybe May 13th. I can't remember. It's on a Thursday night in May. So.
Yeah, he'll give you the full scoop. He's great on all the hickory nuts and the black walnuts and the wonderful native plants that really are fabulous, that can be used for food. But you're probably not going to feed yourself just on a garden that's got native plants. I mean, the Native Americans did. Until European colonization, all the food sources were plants that have been here on this continent for a long time.
So a couple people answered the question too. One person said cranberry, Debbie said rhubarb. Suggestion.
Is rhubarb native? I didn't know that.
I don't know. I guess so.
Cranberries, the wild cranberries are edible. Yeah, they're really nice.
Yeah. So Suzanne's asking if you can offer tips or first steps or resources for those faced with having to replace lawns or turf to start or extend their gardens.
So my advice, again, it sort of depends on how you want to approach it. Some people like to do it a little bit at a time. Some people just want to get in there and do a massive undertaking. And there are different ways to approach trying to replace lawns. Sometimes what a lot of people have done successfully is to layer newspaper and cardboard in, and then planting through it, so that you start to get larger perennial plants established and you don't try to kill the grass. There is a book on meadows, and on our book page, there is a book called Urban and Suburban Meadows, Bringing Meadowscaping to Big and Small Spaces. That's certainly one I would recommend as a good starting explanation of how to work with the lawn issue. And that's Catherine Zimmerman. And she also, if you get into her book, she also has her own website and resources. That for just sort of lawn replacement, that's the one I would think of to start with.
Okay. All right. And then Kathy's asking, in densely populated cities and towns, do you know if there's been an increase in public gardens with native landscaping?
That's another great question. Less so here in the Boston area than I would really love to see, because the number of examples that you could go and use for inspiration. Obviously, there's Garden in the Woods at New England Wildflower Society, well, now Native Plant Trust, that has a lovely, I forget, is it 20-acre property with woodland gardens and a range of gardens that might inspire you. I would personally love to see an example of a much smaller landscape that's almost homeowner scale done, so people could get inspired for that. One of our hopes long term for Grow Native is we don't have a permanent home yet, but we would love to have a smaller, even quarter, half acre, and kind of demonstrate that.
Yeah.
There aren't a ton of good examples for that. In New York City, there's the New York Botanic Garden has a large native plant garden that's a couple acres, and it's quite inspirational to walk through. It has a meadow section, it has a woodland section that's got a beautiful sort of wet section, and the Brooklyn Botanic Garden as well. But other than Garden in the Woods here in New England, I don't yet know of one that gives the kind of inspiration I'd love for people to have. Goes to show you how much work we have to do.
Yeah. So Laura is asking about, what are your thoughts on berries, specifically for deer? Are berries helpful for the ecosystem? My family and I removed 80 feet of Japanese bittersweet and honeysuckle last year and are considering Sambucus elderberry to plant in this place. My neighbor warns me of the Sambucus attracting deer. What do you recommend?
Well, I mean, I don't know where, I'm assuming this person lives probably in the same area where you are.
Probably, yeah.
The deer issue, I mean, the habitat that we humans have created, the sort of typical suburban habitat of lawns and shrubs and a few trees, is exactly the kind of habitat that deer love. We've gone in, I don't know the New Hampshire numbers, but in Massachusetts, I know that at the turn of the last century, around 1900, there were believed to be only about 200 deer left in Massachusetts.
Wow.
And that the current population, well, maybe that as the count, I don't know what it is this year, but a few years back, not maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was being estimated at about 85 or 90,000 deer.
Wow.
And
Wow.
it is a real public policy problem. And it is complicated because the main predator for deer was the eastern mountain lion. And in the early 1900s, with Teddy Roosevelt and other people loving to hunt the eastern mountain lion became extirpated. And that was our best predator for deer.
Yeah.
So that, coupled with the reduction in hunting, and the kind of landscapes we've been creating, have created this horrible ecological problem. There is a book I recommend, just in thinking about that as a public policy issue, on our website. It's a fantastic book by Jim Sturba called, let me just find it here a second, Jim, Nature Wars. And it's really interesting because it's about the coming back of major species that were close to being extirpated that are now significant issues, like beaver and deer and Canada goose. So that's worth reading. I would not plant an elderberry just because deer might come eat it. The deer are there. They're going to come eat most anything they can. And there are not enough species that aren't palatable to them. There are so many good things you can do. Elderberries, got a lot of ecological value. Certainly, you can try to pay attention to deer-resistant species, but I think the larger issue is we have to figure out how we can possibly, use it for human food or find other ways to harvest deer so that the population is not so out of balance, because it is part of why we have a tick problem.
Yeah.
In parts of Massachusetts, there was resistance to honey until the tick problem from Lyme's disease became so bad that everyone's like, well, maybe it's not so good to have this overpopulation. So it gets complex.
Yeah. Are there any native evergreens you would recommend, either as a shrub or a ground cover?
Oh, there are lots, but I would kind of need to know the condition.
Sounds like you should go back to your databases and
look up again, I would really suggest, again, you guys, I'm sure you're still lending books even with the COVID time. And I don't know, what I would recommend for trees is there's Bill Kalina's 3 books on native plants are really some of the best books for perusing. He has a book on trees and shrubs. He has the book on ferns. He has the book on wildflowers, which is really the perennials. And I'm trying to find that here. And so I don't know if you have happen to have those in your library. He has one, tree, shrubs, and vines, wildflowers, and he has the native ferns and grasses. So that's 3 separate volumes that are probably some of the best for perusing and thinking about what would be adapted to my conditions. The fantastic tree book on native trees is by Jim Sternberg. That's also listed, Guy Sternberg. That's also listed on our website. So again, you have to know your site conditions. You have to know are you looking for something that grows tall and mature? Are you looking for something that stays mid-level? Are you looking for ground cover? I mean, there are a lot of juniper ground covers. Juniperus virginiana, which is a great evergreen ground cover, again, in sunny conditions, but I don't know this person's conditions.
Well, when you mention all the books, I just want to make sure people know that, if you use our library, you can always contact us and tell us what books you'd like us to buy, because we'll usually buy at least.
Make sure she buys every book listed on our website, okay?
Right. Let's see, a few more. If you're planting, this is from Rebecca, if you're planting in areas with heavy leaf litter, do you need to amend the soil underneath it?
See, I don't think you do. I mean, so if I use amendments, I use organic materials. So I do, when I plant shrubs or trees, I do use bone meal, which is again organic. And that's because if you're establishing a new woody plant, you really want the roots to grow first, because that poor plant has either been chopped off and balled and burlapped, or it's been grown in a pot and it's pot bound, and you need to tease the roots out well. So its roots need to get established first before it can support the foliage. So you never want to fertilize new woody plants that you're planting with any nitrogen type or even compost. You have to be careful not to give it too much that's going to stimulate that leaf growth when it needs depending on tree or shrub, if it's a tree and it's 8 feet tall, it may take it 3 or 4 years to really get established. If it's a small shrub, it may take a year or 2 to get established. So I'm not saying don't use any amendments. If you do use organic ones, I love Coast of Maine products. They make some good amendments. So again, you kind of have to know what you have. I would suggest, if you have an area that you're really working on, it doesn't hurt to do a soil test, but be careful about a soil test, because they're going to say, what do you want to plant? And they're really going to think agricultural or fruit crops. And you can say, well, I really want to plant native plants. And depending on who's doing your soil testing, they might be able to adapt their recommendations. But typically they're going to say, add this amount of nitrogen and this amount of phosphorus. For me, the reason to do a soil test is to learn my pH, to learn things about how well drained the soil is, not to tell me what kind of amendments to add. Because again, I'm going to work organically and I'm going to work on building that soil over time. I mean, the leaf litter, healthy soil, just another piece of it is that we've learned in the last decade or two, and this is fascinating. I used to think when I started gardening that the best thing to do was to basically like effectively rototill and dig up my soil and mix in the amendments, whatever I was using, however organic they were, and mix in the bone meal. And what we understand now about soil is that soil ecosystem and the fungi in it are so important. And the more we disturb it, the harder it is to get reestablished. And that's why the leaf litter breaking down over time and letting all of the invertebrates and the bacteria and hopefully more fungi, because we tend to have a fungally dominated soil ecosystem. And it is the mycorrhizal fungi that everybody's so interested in talking about now that are in all the roots of all of our woody plants and even in a lot of our perennials that allow the plants to actually absorb the nutrients. Every time you dig up that soil, we're disturbing these fragile mycorrhizal fungi networks that are so important to the health of the soil and the health of the plants. So the reason that the leaf litter breaking down by itself works so well is that all those thousands of creatures in the soil are doing it in some kind of balance that you can't do if you start mixing it up together. Now, that's not to say that you can't plant things without digging and mixing it up, and you may want to do some of that, but just be aware that your goal is not to break up everything in the soil entirely, but it's its own ecosystem.
Okay, just a couple more. This is an interesting one. Matthew's saying, do you have any suggestions for a condo with 12 buildings that went from being mostly a forested property for 30 years and then woke up one day to golf course conditions? Thursdays are a cacophonic miserableness of giant mowers and blowers.
Oh my God. Find your allies, organize your condo association. The mowers, the blowers, and the noise. If I could wave a wand to do anything in the world, I would ban leaf blowers. I can't believe it's called a green industry. It's the types of tools that are used, the negative impacts ecologically, the negative impacts to our mental health. We got to organize. Organize. Again, get kids interested in the trees and the shrubs and the caterpillars they might find. And sorry, I had the same issue. Cambridge has a leaf blower ban, and unfortunately,
Cambridge does.
Unfortunately, it's only a partial ban though. And so, come fall, September at some point, it's all fine again, and then some people don't obey it anyway. But the amount of disruption and the amount of air pollution, and I'm sure we all know this. I mean, when I get talked to say, if somebody's using a leaf blower, do we run away or do we go towards it? What does that tell us? And then it is blowing up the topsoil. And so it's disturbing the top of the soil. It's then getting all kinds of bacteria and stuff into our respiratory systems. It's another one of my pet peeves. I want to do a whole program just on leaf blowers.
Okay, we have 3 more questions. I think we wrap them up. Last week, I received a catalog from the New Hampshire State Nursery. I was surprised to see they suggest buying early because they often run out of seedlings. Any idea what limits production?
The nursery business is really hard, really, really hard. I mean, the nursery growers don't know. First of all, the lead time for even us perennials and ferns is several years. You've got to have stock that you grow up to a certain size that you're able to have reproduce. And we consumers are fickle and our fads are fickle. And so it's hard for them to predict what we're going to want 2 or 3 years from now, if it's a perennial or a fern. And for the trees and shrubs, it can take 10 years. You buy a small shrub, and that may have been through several producers to get to you, quite frankly. There are very few nurseries that grow straight species stock from seed, start to finish. And so it's a hard business. I will say this, and particularly the responsible nurseries, of which most of them are. I have a lot of empathy for them. So yeah, I would say the good thing about the native plant issue is that we are creating a lot more demand. There is a lot more demand now for native plants than there was 4 or 5 years ago. So we're helping create it, and that's great. I don't know if this person is a small retail buyer or is looking for plugs or larger amounts of stock. I'm going to put in a plug for plugs, which is North Creek Nurseries, I believe, will sell retail for large enough buyers. If, for example, let's say you were a small homeowner and you wanted to get your neighbors or some friends together and buy 10 different species of plants in small sizes that you could then use more affordably. Some of the plug suppliers are wholesale only, and some of them will do large orders if you're not just a tradesperson. It's a great way to buy plants, and you may find that it's easier to get the species you want because, and again, it really varies depending on what they're growing. So some of them may say, I will allow you to put in an order for next spring, and we'll set that aside when we have it. That's what a lot of the larger landscape companies do. But I would say get to know whether you're working with a retail nursery that you go to because you're really a retail client, or whether you're willing to do some larger orders and figure out how to do that with a company that's willing to do more of a wholesale buying arrangement. The more you can get to know them, build a relationship, talk to them, ask them what their systems are, what their policies are, the better.
Right.
And so I saw somebody in the chat asked about a particular wrench for removing established Oriental Bittersweet.
Right.
You can Google weed wrenches. I just did it while we were talking. There was a classic weed wrench that was available, and there was some fight over who owned the rights to it. Or I forget what happened. But Google weed wrenches, because there are some things on the market. And again, these are just powerful levers that are better at pulling big roots than we are with our hands.
Yeah. Okay. And then Leela asked, do you have any recommendations for grass replacement for kids to play soccer on?
If you want to play soccer, I think you're going to want a conventional turf. Now, that doesn't mean you have to grow it in the least ecologically way. You can still create grassy lawn areas without using tons of. You can do it organically.
Yeah.
You don't have to use lots of bad chemicals and nitrogen chemical fertilizers with runoff. So I would just say, but the grasses that are part of our turf grasses are non-native European grasses that are adapted for that type of condition. And there is no native grass that does that.
Yeah.
So go for it. Just do it as organically as possible.
All right. And one more question from Maria. Are there any types of native hydrangeas?
No.
Oh.
Well, there is an oak leaf hydrangea, which, so I correct myself, which is a native hydrangea. It has a different character than what your blue hydrangeas. There are so many native plants though that are so beautiful. I urge you to explore the beautiful, beautiful natives and fall in love with them. I'm going to confess that I had the privilege of going to Costa Rica 10 years ago. And I was just so excited because it was this beautiful tropical environment, unlike anything I had ever seen. And I was so enamored of learning about it. And there were a number of people, there was a bus portion of the trip, and there were a number of people who kept saying, and they'd see a blue hydrangea and they'd rave over it. And I'm like, we're in Costa Rica, not everything has to be blue hydrangeas. I understand people have a traditional love for that, but there's so many other beautiful plants. But no, not.
Yeah.
Look up oak leaf hydrangeas. They're pretty cool. They're
Okay.
actually, they have a really delicate white flower. I mean, it's a big
Uh-huh.
flower, but it has a delicacy to it. And the leaf shape and the coloration in the leaf is quite beautiful.
Okay. Well, that's all our questions. I just want to remind people that we did record this, so I'll have that link sent out. I'll send it out to anybody that registered today or probably tomorrow. And thank you, Claudia. Again, you want to tell us the website again? Is it grownative.org?
So the Grow Native website is grownativemass.org,
Mass.org.
MASS.
Okay.
And yeah, please do use the resources there. They're really,
All right.
obviously I wasn't able to give instant answers to everybody's questions because when I go to look things up, there's so many